Hey, Dan.
Good afternoon. How's your day going?
Again,
Good.
it's going okay. It's very busy. How's your day?
It's been okay.
Good.
Because I've already had a class.
Yeah, I have too. Yeah, Tuesdays are long days, I think, for a lot of us.
Yes. And I think that this subject is difficult for people who aren't poli-sci majors sometimes, but it was fine.
Oh, yeah.
It was
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh my
It's a lot of
goodness.
tough reading and writing and
That's right. God.
all right. Well, I'm going to go dark here, but I'm still here.
All right. We know.
I'll pop in and wave to Ashley when she
Good.
joins.
All righty.
Hello.
Hello, Ashley. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Hi, Ashley.
How are you
At
doing?
least I don't have to ask you how your flight was.
Oh. Well,
What
it would have been
is-
worth it to get some of
Oh,
that nice
yeah.
weather that you're having.
Absolutely. It's going to be a fantastic week. But 52 isn't bad for New Hampshire. You're doing all right.
It's true. It's true. We've had worse Aprils or Marches. It's not even April yet, almost.
Right. That's true. And look at what's happening in the Midwest, South Midwest. It's terrible. Jeez.
I know.
Oh.
I'm looking at my lighting. I'm just gonna turn the lighting in the office up
Okay.
a little bit.
Yes,
Let
I
me
can
know
see
if
you.
it looks okay on your end. But
I
that
just sit
might,
by the window.
it's feeling kind of dark in here. It's
Yeah.
8, so maybe it's just it's
Well,
a
that's
mental
true.
thing.
It is dark, isn't it? Do you not
Need a
have
ring light.
window?
I do, totally. So how many students are you having this semester for the
We have
series?
we have 100 students, but then we have a plethora of people from the community who are eager to attend and enjoying it because they don't have to travel. They just turn on their computers. So we're averaging about 140 participants per session, and that's been great. And, you know, sometimes when we're in person, our question and answer sessions they depend on who's there. And the kids feel intimidated sometimes because of for whatever reason. But with our question and answer vehicle, we have good questions and a lot of people write in, and we'll be fine.
That's great. No, it's a perfect setup. I do like this webinar. Yeah, we're such Zoom experts now. We didn't used to be.
I wouldn't claim that title, but I'm getting through it.
Well, I wouldn't either, but for myself. But
How is
it's getting
Jim?
more normal. Oh, Jim's great.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Well,
doing
we
well.
see
We're
him
right
next
down the
week.
hall
Yeah, oh,
from each other.
he'll be here next week.
That's right. Yeah. No, he's doing Becoming Evil, I think.
Always. Yes,
It's a good one.
it's a very good one.
Very
I'd hate
good
to have
one.
to do without it. So our keen professors are taking up about a third of the course, and that's fine.
Good. I'm glad you feel that way. We're
do.
glad to be a part of
truly
it.
do.
And it's so nice this year. Last year was such a I mean, it was right in March. It was such a pivot, but
Yeah, that was
it's really
you were,
nice to be more.
I think you were the
seen.
next week. You were the first one who was going to be up. And so we were in such a scramble and not knowing what we should do. And it was great to
Yes.
get your video, and things went okay, as well as could be expected. But now it's much better. And with any luck, we'll actually get you out here in person next year.
Oh, well, I would love that. I think
Yeah.
passerbys probably thought I was out of my mind last year. I was sitting there in the classroom just talking to myself.
Now they're used to
Recording.
it.
Oh, I'd love to be there in person. Hopefully next year.
Yes, well, that would be great. With our luck, it'll rain. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh no, that's okay. My husband's family is from Merced, so we're kind of
Oh,
used to the weather, but we like it out there.
well, yeah, well, then you can combine this with a visit. That would be great.
Yeah.
I miss the East Coast and the East Coast weather. I like winter.
You're
Do
very
you?
kind.
Hey,
Mhm.
you are welcome.
I was in Rochester for 4 years, which I think is the snowiest place in the continental United States, maybe except for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or something. But I loved it. I love winter weather.
Maybe
Of
you
course, I
can
only lived there for 4 years, so
arrange an exchange.
I don't know. I mean, I'd be willing to do it. I would
Oh, no.
I would live there in a heartbeat.
Well,
I'm serious.
somebody's got to like it.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're about ready now.
And
Okay.
we've barely had a winter here, by the way. So
Ashley, are you ready to roll?
I am. Let me know. Am I okay to share my screen, or you want me to wait?
We can start sharing your screen. That's not a problem. I'm going to do your introduction, and then we'll turn it all over to you.
And we just need you to enable participant screen sharing.
I'm going to make you a co-host right now. Okay.
Okay.
Good. There you are.
Okay.
Perfect. All right. Good evening, everybody. We're very glad to welcome you back after our spring break, and we're very happy to welcome Professor Ashley Greene. Professor Greene is an assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College, which most of us know is the home of Jim Waller, where she teaches courses on genocide, modern Africa, human trafficking, and peace studies and transitional justice. Her research focuses on the relationship between history education and statecraft in Uganda. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development and in several edited volumes, most recently, Historical Dialogue and the Prevention of Mass Atrocities. Professor Greene is the Academic Programs Officer for Africa and Transitional Justice with the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. At the Institute, she develops and teaches atrocity prevention curricula for policymakers in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Zambia, and the Central African Republic. We are very happy to have her here tonight to talk about the intersection of human trafficking and genocide. Welcome, Dr. Greene.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be with you today. So thank you for having me. And Dr. Waller is going to be ecstatic when he hears that at Sonoma State, Keene State College is known as the home of Jim Waller. So it's so great to be a part of this, and thank you so much. So I want to start my time today talking to you about slavery and genocide. And I want to start with this term, slavery. It's a term that we're probably all at least somewhat familiar with, but we may not all know that slavery has a contentious history in genocide studies. So many scholars writing about genocide and slavery have been concerned about keeping these terms separate and with reinforcing conceptual and definitional boundaries between slavery and genocide. And these concerns became particularly contentious in 1951 when African-American activists with the Civil Rights Congress wrote a petition to the United Nations titled "We Charge Genocide." And in this petition, they very carefully applied the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade and of slavery in the American South on plantations. They very carefully applied these crimes to the 1948 Genocide Convention. So they talked about how genocide had emerged out of the inhuman Black ghettos of American cities, out of the plantations of the South, mass slain on the basis of race, as they're talking about crime after crime. The report cited premature death, poverty, and disease, lives deliberately warped and distorted. The pamphlet cited over 3,500 lynchings, systematic inequalities, and pervasive legal discrimination. So this caused concern among some components of genocide and proponents of the Genocide Convention itself. And in fact, even Raphael Lemkin, who you probably know coined the term genocide, was extremely critical of the petition. He felt as though it was a ploy to draw attention away from atrocities that were taking place in the Soviet Union. And part of his thinking may also have been that he was still hoping the United States would ratify the Genocide Convention, which of course they didn't do until 1988. But so part of the concern for Lemkin and for other scholars and future scholars of genocide studies is that the terms genocide and slavery would become conflated. And the fear was that if genocide began being used to describe other types of atrocities like slavery, that it would lose its moral power and it would no longer be clear to people what genocide really stood for. So in 2001, genocide studies scholar Michael Ignatieff said, thus slavery is called genocide when whatever else it was a system to exploit the living rather than to exterminate them. genocide has no meaning unless the crime can be connected to a clear intention to exterminate a human group in whole or in part. And similarly, in a unique comparative study of the transatlantic slave trade and the Holocaust, Seymour Drescher wrote, "As a way of death, the slave trade was kept in being by the maintenance of a continuous flow of living human bodies who were a means to the production of labor. The Holocaust was kept in motion by the production of dead human bodies." So we see in these writings and these conversations that scholars are having with each other, these two phenomenon that seem to be complete opposites. And yet, as we're going to talk about together today, throughout history, we often see these two atrocity crimes happening at the same time. So what I want to think through with you today, the questions I want to be talking about are these. First of all, what can we learn about the relationship between genocide and human trafficking by looking at cases where the two atrocity crimes happen simultaneously? Secondly, can we identify human trafficking as part of the genocidal process, or is it merely a side effect of genocidal violence? And then finally, how can understanding better the relationship between, or the correlations between genocide and human trafficking inform genocide prevention and response? So those are the questions I want you to be keeping in your mind as we go through the rest of the talk. And what I'm going to do after talking briefly about human trafficking and what this is we're going to go through 3 case studies together. But first, just to kind of give us the groundwork for this discussion, in 2000, the United Nations came out with an expanded definition of human trafficking in its protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. And trafficking, as they describe it or define it, means the recruitment, transportation, the transfer or harboring of persons through force, through the threat of force, through coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception, the transport or trafficking of people through abuses of power, or by taking advantage of a victim's position of vulnerability, or giving or receiving payments, all to accomplish complete control of one person over another. So all of this is for the purpose of exploitation. And this is at the heart of any definition of human trafficking and genocide. And exploitation is defined in the protocol quite broadly. As you can see on this paragraph in the bottom, exploitation shall include at a minimum the exploitation of the prostitution of others, forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. So as we can see, slavery is one subset of human trafficking, but it's also a bit broader to encompass a number of other types of exploitation. Now, the Global Slavery Index, which is a wonderful database, and I have the website up if anyone wants to investigate this on your own at some point. In a 2016 study, they found that slightly over 40 million people, approximately 40.3 million people, were enslaved in modern slavery around the world in 2016. And these numbers very likely underestimate the true figures because data is so difficult to come by when we're talking about human trafficking, just as it is sometimes in genocide in terms of looking at casualty figures, etc. So the numbers are probably higher, and certainly today in 2021, probably much higher as well. When we talk about human trafficking, it can be helpful to separate this into 2 types of trafficking. One is sex trafficking. And sometimes this is actually what we think of first. When we think about human trafficking, Some people even think that this almost exclusively applies to sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Sex trafficking actually represents about 22% of modern day trafficking, and 78% is represented by forced labor. So we're going to be looking at both forms of trafficking today in these 3 case studies that I'm going to be talking about. And each case study, we're going to see that human trafficking is operated in very specific ways within genocidal contexts. So I want to start with German Southwest Africa, or modern day Namibia, and the genocide of the Herero. What we know today as Namibia, and you can see it shaded in pink on the map on the right-hand side, became a German settler colony in 1884. And central to this colonization project was the concept of Lebensraum. And if you've studied the Holocaust, you may have very well heard this term before, this idea of living space. And the term was coined in 1897 by the German geographer and ethnographer Friedrich Ratzel. And Ratzel was writing at a time of increasing population density in German cities, particularly Berlin. And as he looked at the rise of urban poverty and the spread of tenements, he argued that the Volk, or the German people, needed space and needed to expand its geographic territory as its population increased, or else it was going to perish for lack of resources. So Ratzel builds this theory of Lebensraum on the premise that superior cultures destroy inferior cultures in battles over living space. And we're going to come back to this idea in our next case study. But in his 1891 book, Anthropogeography, or Political Geography, Ratzel advances a theory that dying out is predestined by the inner weakness of individual races, and that the decline of peoples of inferior cultures resulted from contacts with more advanced cultures. So by 1903, only a little more than 4,600 Germans had settled in German Southwest Africa. And part of this had to do with the fact that the land already belonged to a people called the Herero. And so German colonists and the German colonial state, as you can see in this map that I'll come back to, but this map that I have for you here, had grand dreams and ambitions for the colony. So in this map, they're showing different divisions of the land, mining concessions. They also have plans for railways, public works projects, port cities, etc. But they need the colonists to make it happen, and they need the land to be able to farm and to really settle the colony. So Germans who do go to German Southwest Africa find themselves in this very unsettling situation of having to rent land from a peoples that they believe to be culturally inferior. And the Hereros were a very formidable people. They were able to defend themselves, to negotiate for themselves. And so this is very unsettling for Germans coming with a very paternalistic and very racist view of the world. So what we see begin to happen in German Southwest Africa is this tension between Germans and Herero. And one of the generals, German General Leutwein, said the Europeans flooding into Herero land were inclined with their inborn feeling of belonging to a superior race to appear as members of a conquering army. And throughout the colony, Hereros were beaten, they were flogged, raped, killed with impunity. And as the discrimination and the abuses pile up, eventually in 1904, a group of Herero rebel against the Germans, and they kill a number of Germans, a number of colonists. And this really escalates the German military, and German military officials decide at this point, 1904, to pursue the Hereros' annihilation. So the commander of the German colonial army, Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotta, says no war may be conducted humanely against non-humans. And in 1904, in October, he gathers his troops and puts out an extermination order, what's come to be known as a Vernichtungsbefehl. And he says here that the Herero are no longer German subjects. The Herero will have to leave the country. And if they refuse, I will force them with cannons to do so. Within the German boundaries, every Herero with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. And he says that he'll no longer accommodate women and children, but drive them back to their people. And indeed, they decide to massacre and push the Herero into the Omaheque Desert, poisoning the water holes as they go so that the people perish there. And what makes this case so distinctive in a way is this very explicit order for genocide. So I'm going to play just a very, very short 4-minute clip that gives you, sets a scene for what happens next in 1905, when the German parliament orders von Trotta to accept the Hereros' surrender. And this is one more quote I wanted to share with you. Just weeks later in October, that nation, meaning the Herero, must vanish from the face of the earth.
On the 1st of October, 2 months after the Battle of Waterberg, von Trotta and a group of German soldiers reached the waterhole of Asombo Windimbe. The next morning, von Trotta read out a proclamation to his troops.
I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero people. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children.
The important thing about Asombo Windimbe is the putting down into writing an official sanctioning of genocide. Why did this take place? I think that the situation had reached an extent where the German military believed that this was perfectly acceptable. They did not see that this was possibly controversial.
The Herero people must leave the land. If they do not do this, I will force them with the cannon. These are my words to the Herero people, the great general of the mighty Kaiser.
The thousands of starving Herero in the Omaheque now seemingly had no hope. But in Berlin, the news of von Trotta's extermination order was a shock. The army and its supporters in the Reichstag had badly misjudged the changeable mood of the German people.
When news of the brutality with which Trotta and his troops are putting down the uprising reaches Germany, there are huge and radical protests, above all in the Reichstag, above all among the Centre Party. On this issue, they are radically opposed to the actual policies being conducted. And there are also newspaper articles. It's a national scandal, if you like.
Despite the scandal, the Kaiser refused to order von Trotta to rescind his extermination order. For 2 further months, the Hereros were hunted down in the Omaheque, until finally the government forced the Kaiser's hand. On the morning of the 9th of December, a telegram was sent ordering von Trotta to accept the surrender of the Herero. The German army now began patrols to collect what was left of the Herero people. 13,000 were rounded up. Soldiers took photographs of their work. After 6 months being hunted by the German army, the Herero were terrified and untrusting. To persuade them to surrender, German soldiers and missionaries told the Herero that they'd been pardoned by the Kaiser and would now be allowed to return to their homelands. But this was a lie. What Germany now began was an extension of their policy of extermination, using more efficient 20th century methods. Here, by the old German fort in Windhoek, the capital of modern Namibia, lies the site of Germany's first mass concentration camp. In this tiny space, over 4,000 people were beaten, worked, and starved to death by the army of the Second Reich. What happened here and in other camps across this country is something that few people in Germany and Namibia have been willing to confront. But this is where the Herero collected by the army were sent, and where the first genocide of the 20th century reached its terrible conclusion.
So altogether, 65,000 Herero perish in the genocide, and this is approximately 80% of the Herero population. And what we see in this moment where von Trotta miscalculates the reaction that the genocide would cause amongst the German public, and he's ordered to accept the Herero's surrender, we see a significant turning point in the genocide. And what we see is a moment where the height of the threat posed by the Herero has really passed. The Herero nation has been decimated, and the survivors, who are predominantly, though not all, women and children, are malnourished, they're sick, they're really completely defenseless. And so at this point, officials in German Southwest Africa pivot from outright killing to using the Herero for slave labor. And in what is a very chilling foreshadowing of what will happen in Germany and in Europe under the Nazis just 30 or so years later, the colonial army places Herero in concentration camps. And the term Konzentrationslager enters the German rhetoric for the first time in Germany's history. And these camps were very different from the models that had been previously used by the British in South Africa or by the Spanish in Cuba, where they were primarily used to separate out freedom fighters from their civilian supporters. These camps were very much places of death, where the Herero were meant to perish. But they were also very different from the camp that the Germans would later construct on Shark Island for the Nama people, who they also targeted for genocide. And that camp on Shark Island was solely put there as a death camp, where people and Nama were left there to die of the elements and of starvation. But for the Herero, in the concentration camps that the Germans built in 1905, between 1905 and 1908, instead of killing them immediately, the Germans began using the Herero for slave labor and loaning them out as slaves to private companies. So after rounding up the Herero, approximately 13,000 of them, the Germans built their first concentration camp at Windhoek. And we believe that there are approximately 4,000 people kept there. They also built 2 concentration camps in Swakopmund, and this was the colony's main port. And you can see on the map on the right-hand side, Swakopmund on the coast and Windhoek slightly inland, right underneath those slightly shaded dark circles. So in the Swakopmund camps, Herero began to be transported, and they were transported from Windhoek to Swakopmund and throughout the colony in cattle cars that were known as transport. Again, in a very disturbing foreshadowing of what would happen to Jews in Europe under the Nazis. And they're beginning to use Herero for all manners of public work projects. And as you can see in this map on the right, they had a very grand vision for the colony. And these maps, this one that was probably created in 1905 or so, were meant to attract German colonists from the metropole in Germany to German Southwest Africa. And the map shows railways, roads, postal routes, shipping routes, piers, and heliograph lines. And if you don't know what a heliograph line is, this is the idea where the mirrors are lined up and they use the sun to bounce off of different mirrors. So you can imagine the vastness and the ambitiousness of this colonial project, that they needed labor to make it happen. So the Germans were very bureaucratic in how they went about this. And they were very meticulous in recording how they used the Herero as slaves. So for instance, they first created a number for each Herero slave, and they inscribed these numbers on metal tags. And you can see in this photo on the bottom left, you can see those tags on the men on the ends, wearing them around their necks. And as you know, if you've studied the Holocaust, this would not be the last time that numbers would be used to identify people instead of their identities, instead of their names. Except in concentration camps in the Holocaust, this would be tattooed on people's skin. So they create numbers, and as a person died, that number would be given to a new person. So they're recycling the numbers as the death counts rise. And the Germans lent the Herero out to private labor companies, especially railway companies and shipping companies. They rented them out for approximately 10 marks a month. This would be somewhere between $100 and $150 a month in today's US currency, a very rough equivalent. And then of course, they also used the Herero for all types of labor in the colony. The Parliament building of Namibia today was built by Herero slaves. The railways in particular were built. Ships were unloaded, goods and cargo carried, etc. So the death registers for this period of time show us how fatal this system of enslavement was. And if you go to Windhoek today, there are approximately 14 volumes of registers that list the deaths of the Herero. And the registers almost never include a name. This was typically unknown, but they include a person's age, gender, and the name of the company or project that they were working for. And the most common cause of death, and this was always listed in the register, the most common cause of death was, quote, death through exhaustion. And it was so common for people to perish this way that the Germans made pre-printed death certificates listing death through exhaustion as the cause of death. And so to give us an idea of the casualty rates that we're talking about, between 1906 and 1907, the private railway company, the Lens Company, received 2,014 prisoners to help build a railway line from Lüderitz. Within 6 months, 1,359 had died. This is 67% had died in 6 months' time. So you can see that the purpose was not an indefinite system of slavery. They weren't trying to prolong the Herero's ability to work. This was truly a means of death while profiting from the slave labor of the Herero. So in 1909, when the camps were closed, the very few remaining Herero, and at this point also the Nama who had survived Shark Island, are then sold to German farmers as slaves. So I want to leave this case for a moment, but we're going to come back at the end to talk about these ideas of human trafficking and forced labor happening at the same time and as a means of committing genocide. So the next case that I want to speak about is Australia. And this is a case that spans decades of the 20th century, beginning with frontier violence when Australia first colonizes, or when Britain first colonizes Australia in the late 1700s, and spanning all the way through the mid 1900s into the 1960s and 70s. So this is an extremely long spanning case. And we're going to look at how this case involved a different type of human trafficking, especially the forced removal of women and girls for sexual exploitation. And what we're going to talk about, the term biological absorption. So in the late 18th century, as many of you probably know, and this is just going to be a short recap, but if you've studied Australia at all before, perhaps British history, you know that Britain began using Australia in the 18th century as a settler colony for British convicts. And this starts off in 1788 with the arrival of what's known as the First Fleet in Portsmouth. So like German settlers in what's known today as Namibia, British settlers brought with them their ideologies based on notions of cultural superiority and of racism. And these worldviews would very much shape their encounters with the indigenous peoples they found on the continent. And one very powerful and deadly ideology that shaped the relationship between the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and the British settlers was the belief that primitive civilizations were destined to be replaced by more advanced societies. And this was an ideology very much built on constructs of race and collective identity. So very much through an in-group, out-group construction of us-them relationships. And it's sometimes referred to as a racist eliminationist ideology. And these ideas developed in part through the thinking and the work of writers like Samuel Puffendorf, who, despite his name, is actually not a character in a Harry Potter novel, but he was a 17th century author who wrote about the stages of humanity and humans' evolution in 4 stages. And at the top, he placed agriculturalists and commercial society. At the bottom, he placed hunter-gatherers. And he believed that hunter-gatherers were at the bottom stage of civilization because they had failed to properly or fully cultivate or use the land that they were on. So oftentimes when colonial policies in Australia begin to have a devastating impact on colonized peoples, their demise is seen as an inevitable byproduct of historical progress. This is basically just the way history happens. This was the thinking. And we can see this mindset happening in colonies throughout the world, from Christopher Columbus's encounter with the Taino peoples of Hispaniola to indigenous genocides in North America and America and Canada, colonies like German Southwest Africa, Belgium, Congo, and the list could go on. But in Australia, the settlers who arrived needed access to land for cultivation of crops and livestock. And if they were unable to do this, they would fail in making the colony sustainable and profitable, and the colonial project would fail. And this was perceived as a life and death scenario. So what we see throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s is large-scale violence between frontier settlers and Aborigines. And when Aboriginal groups begin pushing back against settler encroachment, as they begin being pushed further and further off of their ancestral land, as it becomes more difficult to find and gather food, and as the abuses and violations continue, they eventually start pushing back through raids of settlers' farms and their livestock. And this creates a very sharp escalation of frontier violence that becomes indiscriminate massacre of Aboriginal men, women, and children. And the map on the right that you see by an Australian Aboriginal artist, Judy Watson, is part of a multimedia project to map sites of massacre in Australia during this time period. And they've mapped more than 250 here and believe that it doesn't even cover all of the massacre sites, but only based on the records they've been able to find. So in the late 19th century, the Australian government begins implementing a series of policies to respond to the Aboriginal problem. And the first of these policies is called protection legislation. And this confined Aborigines to isolated and very heavily regulated reserves. And these reserves segregated Aboriginal peoples with very few opportunities for careers, for assimilation into Australian society, although that would not even have been necessarily their goal. Certainly very few opportunities to thrive as their own people and their own identity group. And so what was really believed at the time was that if people were segregated into these reserves, they would eventually just die out. And this was very much part of the doomed race theory that we spoke about and that we also saw Friedrich Ratzel talk about with his idea of Lebensraum. Okay, this idea that they were destined to perish. And if we could just segregate them for their protection from frontier violence was the official party line, then they'll just die out altogether. But what the Australian authorities did with people of mixed descent, which they referred to as half-caste, was very, very different. And they believed that through interracial relationships, oftentimes non-consensual, that these people could be biologically absorbed into the white population. And these were called absorption policies. And they were linked to a policy known as the assimilation policies, basically the idea that Aboriginal peoples could be assimilated into Australian society, largely through the forced removal of children. And I'm going to come back to talking about how these policies were interacting together. But for the moment, I want to move on to talk about biological absorption. So what I'm going to play here is just a very brief clip from a film directed by Philip Noyce in 2002 called Rabbit Proof Fence. And what you're going to see is A.O. Neville, who was a colonial official in West Australia, talking about this idea of biological absorption.
Notice, if you will, the half-caste child. And there are ever increasing numbers of them. Now, what is to happen to them? Are we to allow the creation of an unwanted third race? Should the coloureds be encouraged to go back to the black? Or should they be advanced to white status and be absorbed in the white population? Now, time and again, I am asked by some white man, if I marry this coloured person, will our children be black? And as Chief Protector of Aborigines, it is my responsibility to accept or reject those marriages. Here is the answer. 3 generations. Half-blood grandmother, quadroon daughter, octoroon grandson. Now, as you can see in the 3rd generation, or 3rd cross, no trace of native origin is apparent. The continuing infiltration of white blood finally stamps out the black color. The Aboriginal has simply been bred out. Now, we come to the Moore River Native Settlement. Ladies, most of you are familiar with our work here, the training of domestic servants and farm laborers. I would like to thank you for your continuing support. Hundreds of half-caste children have been gathered up and brought here to be given the benefit of everything our culture has to offer. For if we are to fit and train such children for the future, they cannot be left as they are. And in spite of himself, the native must be helped.
So the overarching goals of these policies was to see the Aboriginal tribes disappear as distinct groups of people. This was very much a genocidal strategy. But what matters for the questions that we're asking today is that colonial Australians accomplished this through a system of labor exploitation and sexual violence. So in the clip, we see Aber Octavius Neville, who is the chief protector of the Aborigines in Western Australia. And these were very ironically named groups, the Aboriginal Protection Boards. He's talking about biological absorption. And the reason that he's talking about this to a group of white women is that white female Australians were the connection point between the Aboriginal Protection Boards and settler families. So it was these women who took in Aboriginal girls as domestic servants. And the Aboriginal Protection Boards, sometimes called Aboriginal Welfare Boards, oversaw the placement of Aboriginal girls and women as domestic servants in these white families. So the families paid the board directly, and in theory, the board held the money in trusts, and this was supposed to be returned to the girls after their indentured servitude had ended. But in practice, very few of these women ever received that money. So for the vast majority of girls put into this system, the experience was from start to finish one of slave labor. And this is important when we talk about human trafficking and slavery, because economic exploitation is really at the heart of understanding the crime of modern day slavery and human trafficking. So this was also a system of immense and widespread sexual exploitation. And the idea of biological absorption was that marriages between Aboriginal women and white men would produce over several generations entirely white children. And simultaneously, to talk about how these policies are working together, with all the Aboriginal men confined in reserves, of course, the birth rate between Aboriginal couples as women are removed disappears. So the protection policies and the absorption policies support one another in this way. And this really can be seen quite powerfully through primary documents and statements of the men and women involved in these protection boards. So you can see on this slide that these policies were very clearly genocidal. And here from Victoria Haskins' excellent article, she's quoting members of the Aboriginal Protection Board, and they say the primary intention of the board in removing and indenturing Aboriginal girls was, as stated by one of their members in 1912, to put things in train on the lines that would eventually lead to the Aboriginal camps being depleted of their population, and finally of the closing of the reserves and camps altogether. And it was known at the time that this system also involved in extreme rates of sexual exploitation and rape. So in New South Wales, for example, where Aboriginal girls were particularly targeted for removal, the new South Wales Aboriginal Welfare Board's records for the 1920s and 1930s show a remarkably high rate of pregnancy for girls going into indentured service. And this was particularly true in the cities. So colonial authorities know what's happening and even thought about how this was going to impact the long-term goals of absorption. So the policies connect to our understanding of human trafficking and genocide in another way. In order to supply these domestic servants, the Aboriginal boards began overseeing the systematic forced removal of girls from the protection reserves. And as you know, if you've been studying genocide over this semester, the forcible transfer of children from one group to another by itself constitutes genocide when done with the intent to destroy a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group. And the case of Australia really helps us to understand how this particular policy, when combined with forced labor and sexual trafficking, was such a devastating tool of the genocide. And again, I want to play just a very short 2-minute clip from Rabbit Proof Fence, which as a film tells the story of 2 Aboriginal girls removed under these assimilationist policies and their struggle to get back to their family.
Come and get your rations. Hurry up.
Come for the 3 girls, Maud! No! I'll bring them up in a blackfellas camp.
No, this is my kid, mine!
It's the law, Maud.
No!
I've got no say in it.
No, mine!
Mr. Neville's orders, it's not the paper. Listen, move 1 inch and I'll lock your mother up. Neville's their legal guardian. Come on, little one. You sit up and you stay. I got the papers, Maud. I've got no say in it. Come on. Just get in the Now, the 3 of you, don't move. Nothing you can do here, old girl. Nothing you can do.
So I know that this is a very difficult clip to watch, but it helps us understand why the numerical threshold for how many people have to be physically killed for a case to be considered genocide legally and definitionally is 0. When we're dealing with the forced transfer of children, especially because it destroys the future survival of a people. And these children who were trafficked, who were removed in Australia, are known today as the stolen generation. These children were taken to special boarding schools where they were indoctrinated into white Australian culture, very much like the residential schools for Native Americans in the United States and for First Peoples in Canada. And they were given out, these girls taken to these schools served as the supply of domestic labor for white families. And again, the extent of sexual exploitation and sexual violence was well known among policymakers and the public. So for example, in New South Wales, the board initially placed a restriction on apprenticing particularly dark-skinned girls to white families, quote, in view of the impossibility of their being merged into the white population. And the underlining assumption here is that they're going to end up having children by white men. So in 1916, however, this restriction as well is removed, and the board secures legislative power to remove all Aboriginal girls 14 years and older and to place them into indentured service. And girls were often taken much, much younger than this, but this was the oldest age by which legally they were meant to be taken out of the reserves. Now, by the 1930s, incidences of sexual exploitation and resulting pregnancies were so common that officials had to form policy responses to this. So in 1937, at the Conference of Commonwealth and State Aboriginal Authorities, A.O. Neville shared the following policy in reference to girls and women of mixed descent who had been sent into domestic service. And he said, our policy is to send them out into the white community. And if a girl comes back pregnant, our rule is to keep her for 2 years. The child is then taken away from the mother and sometimes never sees her again. Thus, these children grow up as whites, knowing nothing of their own environment. At the expiration of the period of 2 years, the mother goes back into service. So it really does not matter if she has half a dozen children. And I just want us to sit with this for just a moment and to recognize, again, thinking about the Genocide Convention, the immense physical and emotional harm that's being done through these policies. For a girl and a woman to have experienced this sexual violence and exploitation, to become pregnant, to nurse or breastfeed a baby for 2 years, to get to know a baby for 2 years, perhaps in some cases to come to love that baby, and then for that child to be ripped away from her and for her to be put back in the system, to be raped, impregnated again, and to have the child taken again, and again. And as you can see in this statement, if it happened 6 times to an individual woman, it didn't matter. Okay, these children would be absorbed into the white community. So these 3 policies, all of which connect to the definition of human trafficking, fed into one another in a systematic and terrifying way to form a genocidal program that Robert Van Krijken has described as, quote, breeding out color of both body and mind. And in the end, just with the case of the Herero, I want to talk about some of the takeaways from this case for our conception of human trafficking and genocide and for prevention. The final case, and I just wanted to share with you these photos from the Bringing Them Home report, which is published in 2009, and which actually identified this case as genocide. So I'll give you just a moment to look at those photos. And the report is excellent, and you can access it at the address down at the bottom of the page. So the last case that I want to talk to you about is genocide in Xinjiang, China, against the Uyghurs and Muslim minorities. And I want to talk about this briefly because not only is it ongoing, so this is happening right now as we're talking today together, but also because I think this case really shows us how understanding the relationship between human trafficking and genocide might inform prevention and response efforts. And I'm only going to give a very, very short kind of history of this case, because I believe you're going to be looking at this in even more depth later in your lecture series. But in 2014, President Xi Jinping launched the People's War on Terror in the Xinjiang region. And after this statement, state officials follow up with orders to round up everyone who should be rounded up, wipe them out completely, destroy them root and branch, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. So we can see from the beginning a very genocidal rhetoric, and this is 2014. A year before this, in 2013, the government released documents revealing the plans for a system of mass internment, for a mass internment campaign where Uyghur and other Muslim minorities would be rounded up, trafficked into internment camps, and as we're going to see, exploited as slave labor, as they are also indoctrinated out of their cultural and religious identity and abused in these internment systems. So in March of this year, the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy published a report in which they described the genocide against the Uyghurs as a logical result of a series of sequential and cumulative acts. So I want us to think about human trafficking as one of those sequential and cumulative pieces to this genocidal process. And the case follows a very gradual kind of concern amongst the Communist Chinese Party, or the CCP, over the ethnic makeup of the region that began in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, the Chinese state begins transferring Han Chinese settlers to the region, and their population increases from 6.1 in 1953 to more than 40% in 1982. In the 1980s, we see a growing concern of ethno-nationalism and religious revival. So this concern over the Muslim identity becoming a strong part of the region's identity. And what we begin to see is the labeling of Uyghurs as terrorists, as disloyal, as untrustworthy, and as backwards. And this ties in again to that racial eliminationist sort of thinking. So we begin to see forced detention, disappearances, and amidst these increasingly discriminatory policies, in 2009, a number of Uyghurs stage a protest that becomes violent when state security forces intervene. And after this point, China begins to militarize the region, adds checkpoints, and a very sophisticated and elaborate surveillance system to control people's movements. So in rural areas, people began to need passes in order to travel outside of their town. In 2014, the Chinese government embarks on a massive surveillance campaign that President Xi called nets spread from the earth to the sky. They installed thousands of high-definition cameras with facial recognition software to monitor people's facial expressions, to look for signs of dissent. And some cities in Xinjiang were spending upwards of $46 million on these surveillance systems. So one of the primary bodies that carries out much of this genocide is the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, the XPCC. And this is a very colonial, a body with a colonial history in and of itself. It's a secretive paramilitary organization connected to the state, but it was used to colonize the region with Han Chinese. And you can see here in these images at the bottom, a group of Uyghurs sitting and watching this colonization project happen. And then they're considered national heroes by many in China for doing this. So after the protests in 2009, the government sends ex-PCC cadres into Uyghur homes to conduct homestays, where they document behavior, they take over the education of children, and they begin to tear the families apart from within, the very structure of these families' identities. Now, the state also begins incentivizing marriages between Uyghur and Han couples, and they do this by providing married couples with an annual stipend and educational and career opportunities. But the eugenics initiative also has a much darker side. And this is the coercion of Uyghur women into unwanted marriages with Han men by threatening to place either them or their families into internment camps. And this very much falls under the United Nations definition of human trafficking and forced marriage. So from a prevention standpoint, if we look at human trafficking as a possible indicator of risk for genocide, especially when it's connecting to these ideas of biological absorption, we could look back as early as 2014, possibly earlier, and have reason to be gravely concerned about what's happening in China. This is 7 years ago. So by 2016, China had expanded and advanced its surveillance program, and it was using this program to fill quotas for internment and detainment camps. And the last thing I want to talk about here on this topic is the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. And this was a system that combined the facial recognition software with information biodata gathered at mandatory medical exams, so that the government held facial scans, retinal scans, voice prints, prints of a person's gait or the way that they walked, fingerprints, DNA, and blood type. And all of this information is put into the IJOP and used along with checkpoint information, smartphone checks, and monitoring of Wi-Fi networks to create an algorithm. And this algorithm is used to select or identify people to be trafficked into internment camps. So in 2000, and I wanted to put this up just as a reminder, I shared it before, but again, we see the primary definition of trafficking in persons, and many of these descriptions fit what's happening here, both the use of threat to coerce women into unwanted marriages, abuse of power, positions of vulnerability for victims, etc. So in a 7-day period in June of 2017, security officials send more than 15,000 residents in different prefectures to internment camps, and they arrest over 700 and place 2,000 or so more under surveillance, preventative surveillance. And this is all based on this identification by the IJOP. So in 2018, the camps are significantly expanded, and this follows in 2016 a campaign of removing passports. And this is important because when we talk about trafficking and modern day slavery, vulnerability among victim groups is extremely central to how this happens. And so mobility has already been restricted by this point. People in rural areas are needing passes to travel. In 2016, people who would have had the means to leave China and to escape have their passports collected and taken away, and this makes them extremely vulnerable. It increases their vulnerability. So the Justice Department also begins constructing internment camps that are very euphemistically called concentration centers for transformation through education. And more than 380 are constructed at this point. And in 2018, the system is expanded to include permanent infrastructures and new facilities. And this included very cavernous internment camps that were created or designed to block out natural light. It included enhanced security, including guard towers and barbed wire. And as of March of 2021, 14 sites are still under construction. So government documents show that, and just in terms of numbers, we believe that between 1,300 and 14 internment facilities exist in the region, and these are separate from prisons, and that we believe they hold between 1 and 2 million detainees. So government documents showed that the building of these camps accompanied local procurement requests for weapons of control. And again, when we look at human trafficking, control is very, very important to the definition of human trafficking, control of one person by another. And these lists included electric cattle prods, batons, tasers, stun guns, tear gas, pepper spray, police uniforms, and handcuffs. And we know from witness reports that prisoners in these internment systems undergo torture, sexual assault, forced sterilization, forced birth control, and sex trafficking. And part of this, again, to link back to Australia, is that this system of internment has been used to isolate children. And so children who have lost both of their parents to internment camps are called orphans, and they're taken by the state into boarding schools and orphanages that were constructed in parallel with the internment camps, and they're raised and re-educated as Han Chinese. So again, very connected to Article E of the Genocide Convention, the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. So I want to talk about forced labor and sexual slavery, and then I want to end with some takeaways and leave some time for questions. So we know that alongside the building of the camps, we've seen extensive systems of forced labor. And this is happening not only in the cotton fields, but also in the parallel expansion of factories. So in 2019, this local government work report said for every batch of workers that's trained, a batch of employment will be arranged and a batch will be transferred. Those employed need to receive thorough ideological education and remain in their jobs. So what we're seeing in Xinjiang is that those who are deemed to be sufficiently re-educated then face a life of slave labor. And what we know now is that the Chinese government is incentivizing factories to move into the region and then transferring or trafficking detainees from the internment centers to these factories or these fields as slave labor. And this is connecting very much with companies around the world, including a number of American companies like Coca-Cola and Adidas, whose supply chains intersect with this region. And there's actually legislation being debated right now in the US about what to do about this. So in addition to forced labor, from the very beginning of the internment campaign, and even as far back as the homestay systems, weaker women have been targeted for sexual violence. And this is happening in a number of ways. Now, human trafficking includes instances of kidnapping or forced detention for sexual exploitation. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but this sexual violence is very much connected to Article 2D of the Genocide Convention, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. And witness testimonies, especially this recent February article that came out from the BBC, have documented systematic violence and sexual violence and exploitation of women. So Uyghur women have been targeted for violence. They've been targeted for forced sterilization, forced placement of birth control devices like IUDs, women who have gone into these procedures already pregnant have had forced abortions. Women have reported being given injections that have stopped their menstrual cycles, by experiences of violence that are targeting very reproductive areas of the body. So women have reported being kicked in the stomach over and over again, being raped with electric cattle prods, etc. And we know that the state is targeting intentionally people of childbearing age. So in a leaked report, that shows the reasons that people are selected for internment, the two most common reasons are birth policy violations and unsafe post-80s, 90s, or 2000s persons. And this is essentially an age category. So these would be people between 18 and 40 years old. So all of these policies have been horrifically successful at diminishing birth rates among Uyghurs. And the report that came out found that between 2015 and 2018, population growth rates in the two largest areas for Uyghur populations had decreased by 84%. In 2019, in two prefectures alone, they saw only 3% of married Uyghur women who were of childbearing age give birth. And one prefecture saw the birth rate drop to as low as 1.05% in 2020. And the government is not denying these figures. In fact, in September of 2020, the Xinjiang government sent a letter to CNN attributing these statistics to, quote, the comprehensive implementation of the family planning program. And in the letter, they cited the fact that in 2018, the number of babies born to Uyghur women decreased by 120,000 compared to the year before. So the final thing that I want to talk about that's relevant for us is what we know to be happening in terms of sex trafficking within the detention centers. And what I'm about to share with you comes from this BBC News article that has been corroborated by many, many other reports, journalists, and scholars. And this is an eyewitness testimony. She herself is a Muslim minority who was held or detained for about 18 months. And she says, my job was to remove their clothes above the waist and handcuff them so that they cannot move. Then I would leave the women in the room and a man would enter, some Chinese man from outside or a policeman. I sat silently next to the door, and when the man left the room, I took the woman for a shower. The Chinese men would pay money to have their pick of the prettiest young inmates. Now, this is very important for understanding what's happening here amidst this context of genocide. So the fact that men are coming in from outside, women are reporting experiencing sexual violence, not only from the security personnel within the internment camps, but they're bringing in men from outside, wearing suits, who are average Chinese men out working their jobs, then coming to pay for sexual access to these women. So that also tells us that the state is profiting from their sexual exploitation. So this is very relevant, again, to what we understand as sex trafficking. And I wanted to put these two definitions up here as I talk about just a few conclusions and then open it up for questions. But bringing us back to the beginning, the point here is not to say that human trafficking or slavery is genocide. Because certainly more and more often today, when we look at modern trafficking and slavery, we see that vulnerability rather than identity is the most significant factor in a person's level of risk for human trafficking. And in the majority of human trafficking cases, victims are trafficked without any intent on the part of the perpetrators to destroy a people group based on a collective identity. And this is central to the definition of what genocide is. So the primary purpose of human trafficking is economic exploitation through forced labor or sex trafficking. Similarly, not all cases of genocide have a large or predominant human trafficking component. So in Rwanda, for instance, while the genocide had an enormous amount of sexual violence, and we even see rape used as a systematic tool of genocide, we don't see organized economic exploitation of sexual violence during the primary months of the genocide in 1994. So the point is not to conflate the two atrocity crimes, but to ask that when we see them happening simultaneously, when we see human trafficking occurring in the context of genocide, to understand better the relationship between these two atrocity crimes with seemingly opposite goals. And if we look at the history of the 20th century, we see these two atrocity crimes happen together again and again and again, whether it's the genocide of the Herero, the absorption and sexual slavery of Armenian girls and women after the Armenian genocide, collectivization schemes in the Soviet Union, in Cambodia, or rape camps in Bosnia, and on and on. So I want to end with just a few concluding thoughts. One is that when we talk about this relationship between human trafficking and genocide, we can look at a couple of things, 5 things I want to talk about happening. One is that human trafficking is used to separate families, to isolate children from their parents. And this makes the forcible transfer of children from one group to another easier, a key piece of genocide in several of the cases that we talked about today. The second point is that the control of women and the sexual exploitation of women, including sex trafficking, facilitates in some cases biological absorption. And this again can be a very important component of a genocidal process. Thirdly, human trafficking removes victims from the fabric of society. So in selling the Herero to German farmers as slaves, in placing Uyghurs into lives of slavery in factories and cotton fields after they've been through this horrific abusive indoctrination and internment system, they're separated from the economic, social, and political life of the nation. They're unable to participate in politics, to contribute to the art, to the music, to the science, the culture of the nation in this way. And they're unable to have an economic threshold as well, receiving no payment. So fourthly, human trafficking places victims in a state of continued vulnerability and exploitation. And this is very important, not just for human trafficking, but also for genocide, for perpetrators to feel as though the threat that they did pose, that was perceived, remains low. And human trafficking and keeping victims of genocide in a state of slavery helps to ensure that that vulnerability and exploitation continues. And then finally, we see here profit, that within genocide, slave labor, sex trafficking, commercial trade, and think especially here of Xinjiang and the many companies around the world that are selling products that are tainted by slave labor there, the immense profit that brings to China. So we see human trafficking increasing the profitability of genocide. And so here I'm going to just end by bringing us back to our main questions. And then I really hope to engage with you all in a conversation and questions as well. And the concluding thoughts are these. On this question about what can we learn about the relationship between genocide and human trafficking by looking at cases where they're happening together. One is that perpetrators of genocide will often take opportunities to profit from the exploited labor or sexual access that human trafficking provides. And I didn't mention it, but we also saw this happen in the Holocaust with the slave labor camps and with private companies using Jewish slave labor. So we see this again and again. And this happens, I believe, especially when the height of the perceived threat has passed and perpetrators have assumed near complete control over a victim group. The second question, can we identify human trafficking as part of the genocidal process, or is it merely tangential to or a side effect of genocidal violence? And what I hope I was able to show with these case studies is that we can oftentimes see forced labor used as a means of killing. So a means of accomplishing the genocide, and sometimes just one among other means of doing this. And then secondly, that sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, including things like forced marriage, are often used as means of committing genocide through biological absorption. So human trafficking is not only a byproduct of genocide, but sometimes is intimately interwoven with the method of genocidal killing itself. And then finally, how can this help us understand or improve? How can it inform genocide prevention and response? One point is that human trafficking can serve as an early warning sign for genocide, especially when it targets a collective identity group. And this is important when we talk about upstream prevention efforts, or the strategies and the toolbox that we have to try and identify when and where genocide is taking place and to prevent genocide before it even starts. The second point is that transitions from outright killing to trafficking or enslavement of an identity-based group do not necessarily signal an end to the genocide or a change in perpetrator intent. And this is important for midstream prevention. So the strategies that we use to try and stop a genocide while it's happening. And we need to understand that perhaps when we see methods of violence shift to enslavement or human trafficking, we may not actually be seeing an end to the genocide, but a continuation of it. And then finally, when we talk about transitional justice efforts or downstream prevention, what we can do to help societies and victims repair relations, and what we can do to prevent a reoccurrence of genocide, we need to take into better account consequences of slavery on the cognitive and emotional development of victims, especially on young children, the gendered nature of trafficking in context of genocide, and the vulnerability of survivors who have been subject to human trafficking. And this is vulnerability in terms of economic vulnerability, social vulnerability, and personal, emotional, and physical health vulnerability. And the continued vulnerability of those populations makes them more at risk to be victims of a genocide in the future. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd love to take your questions. And again, just thank you so very much for having me and being a part of this conversation.
Ashley, I have to say that that was a masterful and certainly comprehensive account of the interrelationship between human trafficking and genocide. And I think this really marks a very important and valuable contribution to our lecture series. So we thank you very much. It was outstanding. And now
Thank you so much.
I have pleasure in asking some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Do you believe there should be any points added to the 5 points of human trafficking and genocide?
is a question asking about the 5 articles of the Genocide
I believe
Convention?
so. I believe so.
Yeah, oh gosh, this is a great question. So I think that, yes, I think that the Genocide Convention has long been held to be incomplete or insufficient. And it's insufficient in a number of ways. One, that it only protects 4 identity groups, right? Ethnic, racial, national, and religious groups. And it leaves out a number of other groups who have been targeted or could be targeted in the future based on their collective identity. So gender, sexual identification, political affiliation, etc. And so I think that when we look at the convention, it is important to recognize that this list of articles, these 5 points, are not exhaustive. Now, what's tended to happen in international law is that tribunals that are held after cases of genocide expand on our understanding of precedents in how the convention can be applied. So for instance, the Rwandan, the ICTR held that rape can be used as a systematic tool of genocide. It also held that the media can be accountable for genocide. So one response to this question that's a great question is that we certainly need to continue to expand our knowledge of how genocide happens, to expand the way that we prosecute genocide in law. But I tell my students when I'm talking to them that it's going to be their generation. For those students who go on to be international lawyers and do international human rights law or genocide scholars, it's going to be their generation that has this opportunity to really reimagine and recraft the Genocide Convention.
Today, the State Department condemned the Chinese for the genocide of the Uyghurs. Have other governments been complicit in silence in decades past when they did not intervene in the atrocities?
Oh, yes. I mean, this is such an enormous issue. It is silence, which happens for political reasons. You know, right now in the month of April, which is the month of remembrance for the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire in 1915, we're still waiting on the fulfillment of a promise to recognize the Armenian genocide formally as a government. And when we deal with China, especially, and genocide in Xinjiang, there's immense economic capital behind this crime. And there's a lot of control that the Chinese state, a lot of pressure that China is able to put on other nations. And so it really requires people to take a firm stance and with action behind it to say, this is happening. And so we're not going to participate in trade. And that's why this US legislation, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that's going through legislature right now, is so important, because it would require companies to provide the burden of proof that their supply chains aren't tainted by slave labor in China. And as you can imagine, a number of companies are nervous about this. And what we need is for corporations, not just governments, corporations, consumers, and governments to take a stand and to stop the silence and to just become more educated and more aware of what's happening.
Since the situation in China is still ongoing, can you recommend anything that students and our community members can do to address this issue? Are there organizations addressing this that we can support?
Yes. So one of the things that I encourage my students to do, actually, we're going to be doing this in my human trafficking class later this semester, is to write letters as citizens, but also as consumers to, for example, the corporations that are tied up with the supply chains that are now tainted by slave labor. And these are corporations making products, everything from clothing to shoes to hair products and soft drinks. This is a huge, just a huge range of consumer products and corporations. And ultimately, when we're looking at human trafficking, you know, this is very tied up with economic exploitation. And this is about profit. This is about money. And so, you know, China has always been very resilient to critique. Often will just deny what's happening. China is one of the 5 permanent veto members of the United Nations Security Council. So as an international community, there are limitations on what's likely to happen legally from the UN standpoint. However, where we can really, I think, put our weight behind as students, as consumers, is in pushing corporations to support legislation like the US Uyghur Prevention of Forced Labor Act. And we do as consumers have power behind us. And that's why there are gluten-free and vegan products in supermarkets, because as consumers, we demanded them. So what I would say to students is write to your congressional representatives, write to Coca-Cola, write to the corporations, and have a say in this.
One attendee says your lecture has been the most emotional of this semester. Is there any evidence that Hitler used Ratzel in his plans?
Oh, yeah. So there is. And in fact, I really, if you're interested in these connections, it was heartbreaking for me not to be able to go into them in more detail. But I really recommend the article by Benjamin Madley, and I actually have it on the slide for you as a recommended reading, and it's called From Africa to Auschwitz. And Hitler, in fact, when he was in prison after the beer hall push, the failed coup attempt, he's incarcerated, and this in prison is where he writes Mein Kampf. And while he was in prison, we have records of him having conversations about Lebensraum and about Friedrich Ratzel's work. And in fact, in Mein Kampf, Hitler quotes Ratzel. So he was absolutely influenced by these ideas, as were other key Nazi leaders. For example, Eugen Fischer was a key racial scientist in German Southwest Africa, and he took back the bodies of Herero to Germany universities, where he studied them and advanced racial science theories that also were influential to Hitler and the Nazis. And one of his proteges was Josef Mengele, who of course is the infamous medical doctor who performed experiments in Auschwitz. So these connections are staggering. And I think that, so I'm trained as an Africanist in history and peace studies. And to me, the fact that so often we study the Holocaust without looking at the genocide of the Herero is a very important precondition. This needs to change. I think we can learn a lot about the Holocaust by looking at these connections. So thank you so much for the question.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and I think that your insistence that we look more closely at the Herero genocide is an inspiration for my planning for next year. So thank you for that, Ashley.
Oh, thanks.
One of our students asked, how can average people like us help prevent and stop human trafficking?
Oh, this is a great question as well. The first key is to educate yourself, and I have to congratulate every one of you as students who are sitting watching this lecture, because you're already doing it. You're already taking the first step, and it's not easy right now in the Zoom era to not be together in person, to be focusing on something like this. You're giving up your time to educate yourself about what's happening. And that's the first thing. And if anybody is interested in really taking the next step, I want to recommend a website called freetheslaves.org. And this is a website originally founded by Dr. Kevin Bales, who's a lead scholar in modern slavery. And it's very accessible. They have media and written resources that you can watch, very short 2 to 5 minute videos up to an hour videos and material to help you kind of get a foothold on this topic. And the Global Slavery Index, which I referenced, is also a very unique and helpful database. So the first thing is just educating ourselves. And then I would say, learn what to look for in human trafficking and slavery in your own backyard. This is not something that only takes place elsewhere. People are living in modern day slavery right here in the United States. So learn what to look for. Vulnerability. Do they speak the language? Do they seem fearful? Do they have the ability to travel? Do they have a passport? All of these sorts of things. You can start to recognize this in your own country. And then again, as consumers, to really be aware of how human trafficking is very much part and parcel of our consumer lifestyle. And that's not to put guilt, right? Because guilt doesn't solve problems. And guilt is not a sustainable platform for any type of preventive action. It's not to make you feel guilty, but we need to know that there are conflict minerals in our cell phones and our laptops, so that we can really stand up as consumers and refuse to buy them if companies don't ensure that they're assembling and selling slavery-free products.
I'd like to ask the audience, we have a few more minutes after this final question, so if there are more questions, please do write them down and send them in. The perpetrators who carry out genocides usually tend to deny the genocide because they see it as an outcome of war. It's a war crime. What are some arguments that deny the existence of human trafficking?
Oh, yeah, this is really an insightful question. You know, actually, one of the key arguments is that slavery and human trafficking are now illegal everywhere in the world. So after the abolishment of the transatlantic slave trade and the abolition of slavery as a legal institution, we see slavery change in a number of important ways. One way is it becomes harder to track. It goes underground. When it was legal, it inspired this enormous abolitionist movement that was global in scope. But when slavery becomes illegal, it's easy for people to believe that it disappeared. And sometimes when we think about slavery, we think about the plantation South, or we think about the transatlantic slave trade, and our mind kind of sticks there, it gets stuck. And we think of these things as practices that are over. And so one of the arguments that's sometimes made, for example, this has been an issue in Mauritania, which was the very last country in the world to abolish slavery, is that, well, now we don't have slavery any longer because it's illegal. And we have a law saying that slavery is illegal. But of course, slavery is practiced everywhere. And so one of the arguments is actually about its legality and whether or not it exists at all. It was a really good question, though. I could go on and on about that, but I want to make sure I give time if there's anything else.
Have you by any chance researched whether there are particular types or forms of therapy that have helped the mental health and recovery of a human trafficking survivor?
Yeah, so again, this is somewhere that Free the Slaves has done incredible work around the world. And what they're doing is they're working with local communities. And one of the therapies is education for children who have been trafficked at very young ages, but education, for example, to help them come to a healthier self view, a view of the self. And I shared with the organizers a reading by Kevin Bales called The New Slavery. And in that reading, there's a drawing that was done by a 25-year-old woman. And she drew, she was asked to draw a person. And she drew something along the lines of this. And she was 25. So, you know, she had been enslaved and taken from a young age and just isolated and abused and kept in this family's home as a domestic servant. And so what that shows us is that slavery has enormous psychological and emotional consequences for victims. So part of the therapy that needs to take place is allowing people who've been victims of trafficking the space and the time in a safe environment to build up a more mature and positive view of themselves. And some of this is being done through art. There's therapy being done through music. There's really some incredible work that's being done in that area. Yeah, so thanks for that question. It's an important part of this issue.
Very. Do you feel there is a human trafficking crisis currently at our own borders?
Oh, this is a great question. So I think that absolutely what we're looking at that connects to human trafficking with the migration crisis, and we have a migration crisis at our borders, and especially if you've been reading the news, unaccompanied minors. And what we're looking at is not so much necessarily that people are being forced to come, but we have people, especially with human traffickers, who are luring people to be trafficked, not just at our border, but this is happening between Africa and Europe. People who are promising migrants fast and easy paths to citizenship, better education for their children, economic opportunities, safety for some of these people who are just living in constant fear of violence and political threat. So you very much have the lure. And when we look at the definition of human trafficking, that is a component of the United Nations definition, as is receiving payment for trafficking for the purposes of economic exploitation. So for example, when people are trafficked across the border and they're not detained, but they're brought into jobs where they are severely economically exploited. This is a big problem. And then the final thing I'll say about that is, regardless of the reasons for why people are migrating, or regardless of the fact that in many cases it's voluntary, what we see are enormous plights of vulnerability. And so what we know is that when we see this increased vulnerability, we have extremely heightened risk for human trafficking. So what we have at the border is a population that is vulnerable and at in grave danger of being trafficked for various forms of exploitation. And we know that there are high incidences of abuse, including sexual abuse, taking place for these populations.
Ashley, this was an outstanding contribution to our lecture series this semester. It was insightful, it was riveting, and it was truly inspirational. And I'm sorry to say goodbye, but I'm very pleased that we'll be hearing from you again in a few weeks on the Democratic Republic of Congo. So thank you so much, and good night to you, and good night to everyone.
Thank you, Ashley. It was wonderful.
Thank you as well, everybody, so much. It was so great to be with you.